Welcome to Supreme Court Opinions. In this episode, you'll hear the court's opinion in Southwest Airlines v. Saxon. In this case, the court considered this issue: is an airline employee who works as a ramp agent supervisor a transportation worker under Section 1 of the Arbitration Act and therefore exempt from the Act's arbitration requirement? The case was decided on June 6, 2022. The court held that Saxon belongs to a class of workers engaged in foreign or interstate commerce to which Section 1's exemption applies. Justice Thomas delivered the opinion of the court, in which all other members joined, except Justice Barrett, who took no part in the consideration or decision of the case. The opinion is presented here in its entirety, but with citations omitted. If you appreciate this episode, please subscribe. Thank you. Justice Thomas delivered the opinion of the court. Latrice Saxon works for Southwest Airlines as a ramp supervisor. Her work frequently requires her to load and unload baggage, airmail, and commercial cargo on and off airplanes that travel across the country. The question presented is whether, under Section 1 of the Federal Arbitration Act, she belongs to a class of workers engaged in foreign or interstate commerce that is exempted from the Act's coverage. We hold that she does. Southwest Airlines moves a lot of cargo. In 2019, Southwest carried the baggage of over 162 million passengers to domestic and international destinations. In total, Southwest transported more than 256 million pounds of passenger, commercial, and mail cargo. To move that cargo, Southwest employs ramp agents, who physically load and unload baggage, airmail, and freight. It also employs ramp supervisors, who train and supervise teams of ramp agents. Frequently, ramp supervisors step in to load and unload cargo alongside ramp agents. Saxon is a ramp supervisor for Southwest at Chicago Midway International Airport. As part of her employment contract, she agreed to arbitrate wage disputes individually. Nevertheless, when Saxon came to believe that Southwest was failing to pay proper overtime wages to her and other ramp supervisors, she brought a putative class action against Southwest under the Fair Labor Standards Act of 1938. Southwest sought to enforce its arbitration agreement with Saxon under the Federal Arbitration Act, FAA, and moved to dismiss the lawsuit. In response, Saxon invoked Section 1 of the FAA, which exempts from the statute's ambit contracts of employment of seamen, railroad employees, or any other class of workers engaged in foreign or interstate commerce. Saxon argued that ramp supervisors, like seamen and railroad employees, were an exempt class of workers engaged in foreign or interstate commerce. The district court disagreed, holding that only those involved in actual transportation, and not the mere handling of goods, fell within the exemption. The Court of Appeals reversed. It held that the act of loading cargo onto a vehicle to be transported interstate is itself commerce, as that term was understood at the time of the FAA's enactment in 1925. Citing Saxon's uncontroverted declaration that ramp supervisors at Midway frequently load and unload cargo, the Court of Appeals reserved the question whether supervision of cargo loading alone would also fall within the FAA's Section 1 exemption. The Seventh Circuit's decision conflicted with an earlier decision of the Fifth Circuit. We granted certiorari to resolve the disagreement. In this case, we must decide whether Saxon falls within a class of workers engaged in foreign or interstate commerce. We interpret this language according to its ordinary, contemporary, common meaning. To discern that ordinary meaning, those words must be read and interpreted in their context, not in isolation. We begin by defining the relevant class of workers to which Saxon belongs. Then, we determine whether the class of workers is engaged in foreign or interstate commerce. First, the parties dispute how to define the relevant class of workers. Saxon argues that because air transportation as an industry is engaged in interstate commerce, airline employees constitute a class of workers covered by Section 1. Southwest, by contrast, maintains that Section 1 exempts classes of workers based on their conduct, not their employers, and the relevant class therefore includes only those airline employees who are actually engaged in interstate commerce in their day-to-day work. The Court of Appeals rejected Saxon's industry-wide approach, and so do we. As we have observed before, the FAA speaks of workers, not employees or servants. The word workers directs the interpreter's attention to the performance of work. Further, the word engaged meaning occupied, employed, or involved, similarly emphasizes the actual work that the members of the class, as a whole, typically carry out. Saxon is therefore a member of a class of workers based on what she does at Southwest, not what Southwest does generally. On that point, Southwest has not meaningfully contested that ramp supervisors like Saxon frequently load and unload cargo. Thus, as relevant here, we accept that Saxon belongs to a class of workers who physically load and unload cargo on and off airplanes on a frequent basis. Second, the parties dispute whether the class of airplane cargo loaders is engaged in foreign or interstate commerce under Section 1. We hold that it is. As always, we begin with the text. Again, to be engaged in something means to be occupied, employed, or involved in it. Commerce, meanwhile, includes, among other things, the transportation of goods, both by land and by sea. Thus, any class of workers directly involved in transporting goods across state or international borders falls within Section 1's exemption. Airplane cargo loaders are such a class. We have said that it is too plain to require discussion that the loading or unloading of an interstate shipment by the employees of a carrier is so closely related to interstate transportation as to be practically a part of it. We think it equally plain that airline employees who physically load and unload cargo on and off planes traveling in interstate commerce are, as a practical matter, part of the interstate transportation of goods. They form a class of workers engaged in foreign or interstate commerce. Context confirms this reading. In Circuit City Stores Incorporated v. Adams, we considered whether Section 1 exempts all employment contracts or only those contracts involving transportation workers. In concluding that Section 1 exempts only transportation worker contracts, we relied on two well-settled canons of statutory interpretation. First, we applied the meaningful variation canon. We observed that Congress used more open-ended formulations like affecting or involving commerce to signal congressional intent to regulate to the outer limits of authority under the Commerce Clause. By contrast, Congress used a narrower phrase, engaged in commerce, when it wanted to regulate short of those limits. Second, we applied the ejusdem generis canon, which instructs courts to interpret a general or collective term at the end of a list of specific items in light of any common attributes shared by the specific items. As applied to Section 1, that canon counseled that the phrase class of workers engaged in commerce should be controlled and defined by reference to the specific classes of seamen and railroad employees that preceded. Taken together, these canons showed that Section 1 exempted only contracts with transportation workers, rather than all employees, from the FAA. And, while we did not provide a complete definition of transportation worker, we indicated that any such worker must at least play a direct and necessary role in the free flow of goods across borders. Put another way, transportation workers must be actively engaged in transportation of those goods across borders via the channels of foreign or interstate commerce. Cargo loaders exhibit this central feature of a transportation worker. As stated above, one who loads cargo on a plane bound for interstate transit is intimately involved with the commerce, for example, transportation, of that cargo. There could be no doubt that interstate transportation is still in progress, and that a worker is engaged in that transportation, when she is doing the work of unloading or loading cargo from a vehicle carrying goods in interstate transit. A final piece of statutory context further confirms that cargo loading is part of cross-border commerce. The first sentence of Section 1 of the FAA defines exempted maritime transactions to include, among other things, agreements relating to wharfage, supplies furnished vessels or repairs to vessels, collisions, or any other matters in foreign commerce. The use of other in the catch-all provision indicates that Congress considered the preceding items to be matters in foreign commerce. And agreements related to the enumerated matter in foreign commerce of wharfage, to take one example, included agreements for mere access to a wharf, which is simply a cargo loading facility. It stands to reason, then, that if payments to access a cargo loading facility relate to a matter in foreign commerce, then an individual who actually loads cargo on foreign-bound ships docked along a wharf is himself engaged in such commerce. Likewise, any class of workers that loads or unloads cargo on or off airplanes bound for a different state or country is engaged in foreign or interstate commerce. In sum, text and context point to the same place. Workers, like Saxon, who load cargo on and off airplanes belong to a class of workers in foreign or interstate commerce. Both Saxon and Southwest proffer arguments that disagree with portions of our analysis. Neither of them convinces us to change course. For her part, Saxon thinks that we should define the class of workers as all airline employees who carry out the customary work of the airline, rather than cargo loaders more specifically. That larger class of employees potentially includes everyone from cargo loaders to shift schedulers to those who design Southwest's website. To support this reading, Saxon invokes the ejusdem generis canon. She argues, first, that railroad employees and seamen refer generally to employees in those industries providing dominant modes of transportation in interstate and foreign commerce. She then reasons, second, that all workers who do the work of the airlines have the same relationship to commerce as those who do the work of the railroad or ship. Saxon's attempted invocation of ejusdem generis is unavailing because it proceeds from the flawed premise that seamen and railroad employees are both industry-wide categories. The statute's use of seamen shows why that premise is mistaken. In 1925, seamen did not include all those employed by companies engaged in maritime shipping. Rather, seamen were only those whose occupation was to assist in the management of ships at sea, a mariner, a sailor, any person, except masters, pilots, and apprentices duly indentured and registered, employed or engaged in any capacity on board any ship. Because seamen includes only those who work on board a vessel, they constitute a subset of workers engaged in the maritime shipping industry. Regardless of whether railroad employees include all rail transportation workers, the narrow definition of seaman shows that the two terms cannot share a common attribute of identifying transportation workers on an industry-wide basis. We therefore reject Saxon's argument that Section 1 exempts virtually all employees of major transportation providers. While Saxon defines the relevant class of workers too broadly, Southwest construes Section 1's catch-all category, any other class of workers engaged in foreign or interstate commerce, too narrowly. The airline argues that only workers who physically move goods or people across foreign or international boundaries, pilots, ship crews, locomotive engineers, and the like, are engaged in foreign or interstate commerce. So construed, Section 1 does not exempt cargo loaders because they do not physically accompany freight across state or international boundaries. Southwest's reading rests on three arguments. None persuades us. First, taking its turn with ejusdem generis, the airline argues that because seamen are employed on board a vessel, and railroad employees is somewhat ambiguous, we should limit the exempted class of railroad employees to those who are physically on board a locomotive as it crosses state lines. Then, having limited railroad employees in that way, Southwest likewise urges us to narrow Section 1's catch-all provision to exclude those airline transportation workers, like Saxon and other cargo loaders, who do not ride aboard an airplane in interstate or foreign transit. Southwest's application of ejusdem generis is as flawed as Saxon's. It purports to import a limitation from the definition of seamen into the definition of railroad employees and then engrafts that limit onto the catch-all provision. But by conceding that railroad employees is ambiguous, Southwest sinks its own ejusdem generis argument. Again, the inference embodied in ejusdem generis is that Congress remained focused on some common attribute shared by the preceding list of specific items when it used the catch-all phrase. By recognizing that the term railroad employees is at most ambiguous, Southwest in effect concedes that it does not necessarily share the attribute that Southwest would like us to read into the catch-all provision. Ejusdem generis neither demands nor permits that we limit a broadly worded catch-all phrase based on an attribute that inheres in only one of the list's preceding specific terms. Second, Southwest argues that cargo loading is similar to other activities that this court has found to lack a necessary nexus to interstate commerce in other contexts. But the cases Southwest invokes all addressed activities far more removed from interstate commerce than physically loading cargo directly on and off an airplane headed out of state. In Gulf Oil Corporation v. Kopp Paving Company, for instance, this court held that a firm making intrastate sales of asphalt was not engaged in interstate commerce, merely because the asphalt was later used to make interstate highways. Being only perceptibly connected to instrumentalities of interstate commerce was not enough. Similarly, in United States v. American Building Maintenance Industries, this court held that simply supplying localized janitorial services to a corporation engaged in interstate commerce does not satisfy the in-commerce requirement in Section 7 of the Clayton Act. In each case, the court explained that the relevant firm was not engaged in interstate commerce because it did not perform activities within the flow of interstate commerce. But unlike those who sell asphalt for intrastate construction or those who clean up after corporate employees, our case law makes clear that airplane cargo loaders plainly do perform activities within the flow of interstate commerce when they handle goods traveling in interstate and foreign commerce, either to load them for air travel or to unload them when they arrive. Third, Southwest falls back on statutory purpose. It observes that Section 2 of the FAA broadly requires courts to enforce arbitration agreements in any contract evidencing a transaction involving commerce, while Section 1 provides only a narrower exemption. This structure, in its view, demonstrates the FAA's pro-arbitration purposes and counsels in favor of an interpretation that errs on the side of fewer Section 1 exemptions. To be sure, we have relied on statutory purpose to inform our interpretation of the FAA when that purpose is readily apparent from the FAA's text. But we are not free to pave over bumpy statutory texts in the name of more expeditiously advancing a policy goal. Here, Section 1's plain text suffices to show that airplane cargo loaders are exempt from the FAA's scope, and we have no warrant to elevate vague invocations of statutory purpose over the words Congress chose. Latrice Saxon frequently loads and unloads cargo on and off airplanes that travel in interstate commerce. She therefore belongs to a class of workers engaged in foreign or interstate commerce to which Section 1's exemption applies. Accordingly, we affirm the judgment of the Court of Appeals. It is so ordered. Justice Barrett took no part in the consideration or decision of this case. Thanks for listening. This podcast is not affiliated with the United States Supreme Court or its staff in any way. If you would like to support my efforts to make Supreme Court opinions available to the public, please go to the podcast's website. It's at anchor.fm/SCOTUS-opinions/support. Again, the website address is anchor.fm/SCOTUS-opinions/support. There you can also see other episodes and send a message to me, the podcast's creator. Thank you.